What is up, all y'all out there, and welcome to another great episode of The Sully Show, where I drink some whiskey and give you my thoughts. Today, though, we aren't doing a whiskey review. We're going to change it up a little bit, and instead we're going to Sully's School of Alcohol. So we're doing a little educational video on the different types of whiskey out there. So when you walk into a liquor store or you're trying to buy some whiskey, you know the difference in whiskey, bourbon, rye whiskey, blended bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, all the different selections out there. You'll be able to read each one and kind of have an idea of what it means and how it differs from all the other whiskeys on the shelf. So you can make the best selection for you and enjoy some good old whiskey. Before we dive into the details of what makes what, it's not a kind of confusing sentence, but I'm pretty sure it's grammatically correct. So before we dive into that, this was an interesting thing I thought I'd throw in this video. The Gaelic Irish word, or the Irish Gaelic word, I don't know which one goes in front there, but for whiskey is Usa Bertha. Probably pronouncing that wrong. Can't pronounce English words right most of the time, so doubt I'm pronouncing that right. But it directly translates to water of life. But it's how you say whiskey in Irish Gaelic, Gaelic Irish, something like that. So just thought that was kind of neat. Hopefully we'll educate y'all. If there's anything I missed, feel free to drop it in the comments. This list was compiled from a bunch of different resources. None of them completely agreed with the other. So this is kind of the main bullet points that everyone could agree on and we could all get straight. I'm also doing a second part to this video on more in-depth whiskey terms, such as like the bottled and bond, single barrel, small batch, what do all those things mean? I'm doing a second video on that, so look out for part 2 for a little bit more scoped in view of whiskey terms. But this is just broad definition whiskey terms. What is what is what? We will dive straight into it, starting with bourbon. Just straight bourbon. What does something have to be to considered a straight bourbon? It has to be made from at least 51% corn. Has to be aged in new charred barrels for at least 2 years. Has to be bottled between 80 and 100 proof and can have nothing added to it. No colors, no flavors, no spirits, nothing. Has to be good old bourbon. The most popular bourbon out there that I'm sure all y'all know is Jim Beam. That's a good example of what a straight bourbon is. Just bourbon, nothing added to it. Now next, adding on to that nothing added to it, we're going to blended whiskey, which is 51% straight whiskey, but it can have colors and flavors and spirits added to it. So you can mix it with other liquors. You can throw some color in there to make it lighter, make it darker, whatever you want, and you can add your flavors. So I believe like the Smoky Mountain Peach, that was a Tennessee whiskey, technically, I believe. But, that'd be like a blended bourbon or something like Jim Beam Peach, I believe would be a blended bourbon. Because it's not straight bourbon, but it's bourbon. Just you added to it. You added flavors to it. So that's an example of a blended bourbon. As well as Old Elk is another blended bourbon that's not flavored, but it's a, nothing but whiskey, but it's a blended bourbon there. Moving on to the next state over, a lot of that was Kentucky. So moving on to the next state is Tennessee whiskey. For something to be considered Tennessee whiskey, it has to be straight bourbon, same requirements as straight bourbon. The 51%, nothing added, aged 2 years in a new charred oak barrel. But it has to be filtered with charcoal. Now, filtering with charcoal is known as the Lincoln County process. It was designed in Lincoln County, Tennessee. It's kind of their thing. Nobody messes with it because they do it the best and, they can do it. So that's basically what it has to be considered Tennessee whiskey. Now, filtering with charcoal takes out the impurities as well as jump starts the aging process. So it lets them get a little bit more age in there without having to let the barrel sit for an extra amount of time. And the most popular one, I'm sure you've guessed it, good old Jack Daniels. Can't beat it, can't go wrong with it. Stuff's wonderful. Moving on to the next category. This is almost like a subcategory of a distillery, if that makes sense. but it is rye whiskey. So, you know, unlike bourbon, where like Jim Beam's a bourbon maker, Tennessee whiskey, Jack Daniels is a Tennessee whiskey maker. A lot of people make rye whiskey. It's like it's something a distillery makes. However, it's become such a popular thing that it pretty much just had its own category now, known as rye whiskeys. So in order for something to be a rye whiskey, it has to have 51% rye mash, 80 to 160 proof bottled. So it can be a little bit higher than your bourbons because they have to be 80 to 100. So rye whiskey can be a little bit higher than that. Same thing, new charred barrels for at least 2 years. Now, your most popular rye whiskeys out there would be Woodford Reserve. They have a rye whiskey. Bullet Bourbon has a rye whiskey. I believe Jack Daniels has a rye whiskey, but don't quote me on that because I could be wrong. Moving on to our next category is white whiskey, moonshine, corn whiskey. They're all the same thing, different names. Basically, this is just whiskey that has not been aged. So any whiskey that doesn't go in a barrel to age, or it doesn't get aged, is white whiskey, moonshine, corn whiskey. Now, the moonshine that we're talking about here, the stuff you see in the shelves, like the old smoky moonshine, isn't real moonshine. Anything that is legally, or that is like, you have to pay taxes on, it's like a legal thing, isn't real moonshine. All right, real moonshine comes from your Uncle Billy Bob, who made it one time. Might turn you blind, might get you drunk, might start a fire, might kill you, who knows. You know, but that's real moonshine, stuff that's illegal to sell. But the stuff you see in the store is just white whiskey. So in order to be considered that, it has to be made with at least 80% corn. So it's, I guess not, I can't say 99%, but it's mostly corn whiskey is what that is. Now, Scotch whiskey, believe it or not, has to be made in Scotland. And it has to be made predominantly with barley, but it can have other grains in it. It will normally have caramel coloring, has to be at least 80 proof or up, is aged 3 years at least in an oak barrel, distilled twice, and that's really all of it. So basically they distill it once, distill it twice distilled. That's how that works. But it has to be made in Scotland is the big thing. For it to be considered Scottish whiskey, has to follow all that and be made in Scotland. Which makes sense, because if it was made in Germany, wouldn't make sense to call it Scottish whiskey. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying. It has to be bottled in Scotland before it leaves to be known as Scottish whiskey. So even if it's made in Scotland, aged in Scotland, but shipped out of Scotland in a barrel, no longer Scottish whiskey. It has to be made, barreled, and bottled in Scotland before it ships out. So the most common Scotch whiskeys you probably know are Dewar's and Johnny Walker. Those are both Scotch whiskeys. So Japanese whiskey, basically no regulations on Japanese whiskey essentially. The only regulation that they have is it has to be bottled in Japan. So most Japanese whiskey isn't actually made in Japan. They import it from all sorts of different places. A lot of it is Scotch based, like with that malted barley and everything like that. A lot of it, they get it from Scotland, but the only regulation is it has to be bottled in Japan. I don't have an example of Japanese whiskey, but if you go to the liquor store and you see a bottle with Japanese writing on it, chances are very, very high that is Japanese whiskey. If you want to try some, go get some. I've never had any. Haven't even heard of Japanese whiskey until like a couple months ago. But apparently it's a thing, and I hear it's not that bad. So if you want some, go try some. Maybe at some point I'll bring some onto the channel. I don't know. You'll have to wait and see. Subscribe, like, and you'll figure it out. Moving on down the line to my personal favorite. Something you cannot go wrong with. Irish whiskey. Tried to do an Irish accent. Didn't work. Don't make fun of me for it. Irish whiskey has to be aged at least 3 years, triple distilled, and bottled at no less than 80 proof, which is 40% alcohol. Now, I'm sure you all noticed that that 80 proof seems to be a pretty fine line, and there's actually a reason for that. But you have to watch part 2 to figure out what it is, because it's coming next. And if I tell you now, it's going to spoil the episode. So I can't tell you now, all right? Just wait for part 2, okay? It's coming. Don't worry about it. It'll only be here, all right? The most popular Irish whiskeys out there, Proper 12 is Irish whiskey. Bushmill is Irish whiskey. And obviously, the one and the only John Jameson Irish whiskey. The best stuff you will ever drink. But that's what Irish whiskey has to be. And Jameson should be in its own category, I feel like. But legally, it's just not, which is messed up. But, maybe we'll petition to get that done one day. Now, moving on to the last type of whiskey before we shift gears a little bit is Canadian whiskey. Now, it must be aged for 3 years in Canada in wooden barrels. That's pretty much the only requirement. Canadian whiskey is not regulated at all. It doesn't matter if the barrels are new, if they're old, if they're charred, if they're not. It basically just has to be aged for 3 years in Canada. And then you can call it Canadian whiskey. The mash normally has a bunch of different grains. Each distillery uses their own. Doesn't really matter what the grains are. As long as your stuff is made in Canada, you can call it Canadian whiskey. For example, Crown Royal. Okay? Technically, it's blended. Believe it or not. Crown Royal isn't distilled, barreled, bottled all by itself. Alright? Crown Royal is a mix of different type of whiskeys going into one bottle. So technically, it's blended. But it's called Canadian whiskey because it's made in Canada and there's no regulations on it. No one's going to tell them they can't do it. The most popular true Canadian whiskey, though, is Lot 40. Never heard of it in my life. But that's a Canadian whiskey that is actually distilled, barreled, bottled, all by itself, nothing added to it. At least as far as I was able to figure out. Now moving on, shifting gears a little bit, still kind of a whiskey, but kind of not. I feel like, it kind of depends on who you are, where you put this category. I don't necessarily put it with whiskey, but it's a dark liquor that isn't dark rum, so I don't know. Drop a comment if you think Brandy is whiskey or not. I don't think it is, but if you think it is and you have a good reason for it, tell me in the comments why. So this next one right here is Brandy. It's liquor made with fruit juice or wine. Alright? I couldn't figure out exactly if it has to be aged a certain amount of years, if it has to go in a barrel or whatever. Couldn't quite figure all that out. If you know, drop in the comments. But it's liquor made with fruit juice or wine. Normally, though, they use white wine. Pretty bad at my R's and W's, in case you all haven't noticed. The most popular brandy is E&J. There'll be future episode. I have some in the house. I haven't made a video on it yet, but future episode you will see some E&J. So we will have some brandy on this show soon. But that's basically what brandy is. Now, cognac. I'm sure a lot of y'all have probably heard cognac once or twice in your life, and you might not even know what it is still. I was pretty confused at what it is until a couple days ago when I started Googling stuff for this video. But cognac is brandy, believe it or not. That's why a lot of times in the liquor store, you'll see brandy, big on the sign says brandy, and they'll have cognac under it. Because it's the same thing, right? The only difference is cognac has to be made in the Cognac region of France. So if brandy isn't made in the Cognac region of France, it's brandy. If it is, it's cognac. Pretty simple to follow. But it's made under there, and the most popular ones that you'll hear about, Remy is one. Shout out my boy Mac. He put me on some Remy. Stuff's not too bad. So Remy's the second most popular. The most popular one, I'm sure all of y'all have heard of it, is Hennessy, aka Henny. I've had it like once or twice. I wasn't too impressed, but we'll probably bring it on the show in a little bit. Retry it now that I'm a little bit more sophisticated and see how it is. But that wraps it up right there. I hope y'all were able to get a little bit some education out of this and everything, wine yourself a little something next time you go to a liquor store, you might be a little more confident and making a selection and knowing what exactly you're picking out and knowing what exactly is what. If you did enjoy this video, please subscribe, like, leave a comment if I can improve anything, if I missed anything, if I said something wrong, or if there's some alcohol you want me to try for one of my future videos. Drop all that in the comments and like and subscribe. Until then, go check out some of my other videos. I guess over that way, probably. Not quite sure how YouTube works yet. Go check them out, and hope you all enjoyed it. Cheers.